Clara didn't ask for permission to take over my life. She simply assumed it was her right. And I, blinded by a desperate need for family harmony, handed her the keys to everything I owned. She arrived with a suitcase in one hand and a smile that seemed to promise a peace I didn't know I was missing. My son, Leo, stood behind her, his hands on her waist, looking like a man who had finally found his North Star. At the time, I didn't see the calculation in her eyes. I only saw a young woman who looked like she could carry the weight of our family's future. I was tired. 30 years of maintaining the estate, managing the books, and being the emotional pillar for my husband, Arthur, had left me hollow. When Clara offered to help with the first holiday dinner, I felt a wave of relief so intense it felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. The transformation of our home happened in tiny, almost invisible increments. It started with the placement of the silverware, then moved to the way the garden was pruned, and eventually bled into the way our bank accounts were managed. Clara had a way of making you feel like your own methods were slightly outdated, not through insults, but through a suffocating kind of kindness. "You've worked so hard, Elena," she would whisper, gently taking the ledger from my hands. "Let me handle the stress of the payroll this month. You should be resting. You should be enjoying the life you built." I let her. I sat in my armchair and watched her slender fingers move across the pages of our lives, erasing my presence line by line. I thought I was being cherished. In reality, I was being liquidated. Leo was completely under her spell. He had always been a sensitive boy, prone to bouts of self-doubt, but Clara turned him into a stranger. He started using her vocabulary, adopting her cold, analytical way of looking at the world. But to me, she remained the perfect daughter-in-law. She would spend her afternoons sitting at the foot of Arthur's bed when his heart began to fail, reading him the news in a voice that was as steady as a surgeon's hand. She became indispensable. That is the word that haunts me now. Indispensable. She made it so that the house couldn't breathe without her permission. She knew where every secret was buried, not because I told her, but because she went looking for them while I was busy thanking God for her arrival. We gave them the east wing of the house, a space that had been in our family for generations. I watched as she stripped away the old wallpaper, the patterns my mother had chosen, and replaced them with muted, modern tones that felt like a hospital. She was sanitizing our history, preparing it for her own narrative. Arthur and I would sit in the living room, surrounded by furniture she had suggested we buy, feeling like guests in our own skin. Yet, every time a doubt crept into my mind, she would perform some act of grand devotion that made me feel guilty for even questioning her. She organized a surprise anniversary party for us that was so lavish, so perfectly executed, that I cried in her arms, calling her the greatest blessing of my old age. The financial infiltration was the most subtle of all. She convinced us that our assets needed protection from the changing market. She spoke of trusts, of offshore diversifications, of legal shields that only she, with her modern business degree, could truly navigate. Arthur, who was tired of the struggle, signed whatever she put in front of him. I followed suit. We were a fortress, we thought. We were securing Leo's inheritance. We were making sure that when we were gone, the family name would remain synonymous with stability. Clara was the architect of this security. She sat at the head of the dining table more and more often, carving the roast with a precision that was almost frightening, while Leo looked on with a devotion that bordered on worship. I lived in a state of curated bliss. I didn't notice that my old friends stopped calling because Clara had told them I was too frail for visitors. I didn't notice that the staff, people who had worked for us for decades, were being replaced one by strangers who only reported to her. I was being isolated in plain sight, wrapped in expensive silks, and fed the finest meals, all while the ground beneath my feet was being sold off acre by acre. I was a queen in a kingdom that no longer belonged to me, and my crown was made of the very lies I had helped her tell myself. She was the daughter I never had, and I was the victim she had been waiting for her entire life. The shift didn't happen with a scream or a grand argument. It happened in the pauses between our conversations, in the way the air in the room seemed to chill whenever I walked in. It started with the doors. Clara began keeping the door to the study close, the room where all our family records and financial documents were kept. For 30 years, that door had remained open, a symbol of the transparency between Arthur and me. But now, whenever I approached, I would hear the sharp click of a lock or the hushed, urgent tone of Clara's voice on the telephone. If I knocked, she would open it just a crack, her smile not reaching her eyes anymore. Just finishing some boring paperwork, Elena. Go back to your tea, dear. You shouldn't worry your head with these numbers. The sweetness was still there, but it felt metallic, like a blade hidden in velvet. I noticed, too, that Leo was becoming a ghost in his own home. He stopped looking me in the eye during dinner. He would keep his head down, staring at his plate, while Clara dominated the conversation with talk of restructuring and long-term efficiency. When I tried to bring up a memory from his childhood, something to bridge the growing gap between us, Clara would deftly steer the conversation back to the present. It was as if she were systematically erasing my history with my own son, replacing my stories with her data. One evening, I reached out to touch Leo's hand, and he flinched. Not a violent movement, but a subtle withdrawal, a tiny physical rejection that hurt more than a slap in the face. He looked at Clara for permission to speak, and she gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of the head. My son was being rewired, and I was being unplugged. Then came the simplification of my daily life. My car keys disappeared from the hook in the hallway. When I asked about them, Clara explained with a sigh of forced empathy that she had sold the car. We noticed you were getting a bit shaky on the turns, Elena. It's for your safety. Besides, I'm here to drive you wherever you need to go. I wasn't shaky. I was 64 years old and perfectly capable of driving to the grocery store. But suddenly, I was a prisoner of her schedule. If I wanted to visit a friend, she was too busy. If I wanted to go to the park, the weather was too damp for my lungs. She was building a wall of concern around me, but the bricks were made of isolation. I began to feel like a piece of furniture that was being moved to a corner where it wouldn't be noticed. The most painful part was the silence from Arthur. His health was declining, and Clara had taken full charge of his medication. She insisted on being the only one to administer his pills, claiming that the regimen was too complex for me to handle. Whenever I tried to sit with him, she would appear in the doorway within minutes, claiming he needed absolute rest, or that it was time for his specialized therapy. I would watch from the hallway as she whispered to him, her hand stroking his hair in a way that looked loving to a stranger, but felt possessive to me. Arthur looked confused, his eyes searching for mine, but Clara was always there, a beautiful, impenetrable barrier between a husband and a wife. I started to wonder if the medicine was making him tired, or if she was simply making him disappear. I found myself wandering the halls of my own house at night, feeling like a thief in the dark. I would touch the walls, the portraits, trying to reclaim the sense of belonging that was slipping through my fingers. One night, I passed by the kitchen and heard Clara talking to someone. Her voice wasn't the silk-over gravel tone she used with me. It was cold, sharp, and predatory. "The old man is almost out of the way," she said. "The mother is the only problem left. She's more stubborn than she looks, but don't worry. I'm eroding her, piece by piece. By the time the papers are finalized, she won't even remember she owned this place." My heart stopped. I stood there, frozen in the shadows, my breath hitching in my throat. I wanted to burst in, to scream, to demand an explanation. But a paralyzing fear took hold of me. If I confronted her now, without proof, without Leo's support, she would simply call me confused or senile. She had already laid the groundwork for my disappearance. The daughter I had loved was gone, replaced by a cold-blooded architect of my ruin. I looked down at the gold locket she had given me, the one that said family is forever, and for the first time, it felt like a noose. I realized that every kind gesture, every help she had offered, had been a calculated move to strip me of my agency. She wasn't building a family, she was executing a takeover. And the most terrifying part was that I had invited her in. I had opened the gates. Now, as I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to the floorboards creak under her footsteps, I realized I wasn't just losing my home. I was losing my reality. The world I thought I lived in was a fiction, and the ending was being written by a woman who didn't believe in mercy. It's the small things that erode your soul first. It started with my garden, the one place where I felt the earth was truly mine. For decades, I had tended to the hydrangeas and the roses with a devotion that bordered on religious. One morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I rushed to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs, only to see 3 strangers tearing up the flower beds I had planted with Leo when he was just a boy. Clara was standing there, clipboard in hand, pointing at the soil, as if she were directing a construction site, not a demolition of my memories. When I ran outside, breathless and trembling, she didn't even look up at first. When she finally did, her expression was one of practiced, condescending pity. "It was becoming a mess, Eleanor," she said, her voice flat. "All that decaying organic matter. It's not good for the curb appeal. We're putting in something more, low maintenance. Something that fits the new aesthetic of the brand. the brand. My life had become a brand to be managed, and my history was just decaying organic matter. The house began to smell different, too. She replaced my sandalwood candles and the scent of slow-cooked stews with a sterile, ozone-like fragrance that felt like a hospital wing. It was as if she were trying to bleach the very air of my presence. I would walk into the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea, and I'd find that the cabinets had been rearranged. The mugs I had used for 20 years were gone, replaced by uniform, white porcelain that felt cold to the touch. When I asked where my things were, Clara would smile that thin, razor-like smile and say, "Oh, I put those old, chipped things in the attic. They were cluttering the visual space. Dear, don't you feel much lighter now?" I didn't feel lighter. I felt like I was being erased, one porcelain cup at a time. I tried to talk to Leo. I waited until Clara was out running errands, which I now knew meant meeting with lawyers or bankers, and I cornered him in the hallway. I took his face in my hands, hoping to find the boy I had raised. "Leo, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Look at what's happening. This isn't our home anymore. I feel like a ghost here." For a second, just a heartbeat, I saw a flicker of the old Leo. His eyes softened, and he started to reach for me. But then, he glanced toward the stairs, toward the empty space where Clara usually stood, and his face went completely blank. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear. "Mom, you're just tired," he said, his voice sounding like a rehearsed script. "Clara is doing everything for us. She's modernizing the estate. You should be grateful. You're getting older. You get confused about how things should work." That word confused became her favorite weapon. She started using it in front of others. When our old neighbor, Mrs. Gable, managed to slip past the gatekeeper and visit me, Clara stayed in the room the entire time. Every time I tried to tell a story or share a piece of news, Clara would gently interrupt, patting my hand with a look of feigned concern. "Oh, Elena, you're misremembering again," she would say to Mrs. Doc Gable. "Mother has been having these little episodes. We're looking into specialists." I saw the look of doubt in Mrs. Gable's eyes. I saw her look at me with pity instead of friendship. Clara was poisoning my reputation, building a case for my incompetence right in front of me. I wanted to scream that I was fine, that I was sane, but I knew that the more I protested, the more unstable I would appear. She was a master of the gaslight, and I was the one slowly losing sight of the truth. At night, the isolation felt physical, like a heavy blanket made of lead. I began to notice that the landline in my room had no dial tone. My cell phone, which Clara had offered to update for me, now had a password I didn't know and was locked for security reasons. I was in a house worth millions, surrounded by the finest things, and I couldn't even call for help. I would sit by Arthur's side, watching his shallow breathing, and I would whisper to him, "Arthur, wake up. Please, wake up. She's taking everything." But he was lost in a fog of her making, his hand limp in mine. I realized then that she hadn't just taken our money, she had taken our voices. We were two old trees, being hollowed out by a parasite that looked like a flower. And the most terrifying thought of all was that no one was coming to save us, because according to the world Clara had carefully curated, we were already gone. I began to spend my mornings in the small, sun-drenched chapel at the edge of our estate. It was the only place where Clara's influence felt thin, where the sterile scent of her modern life couldn't quite mask the ancient smell of incense and old wood. I would sit there for hours, not even praying in the traditional sense, but just holding onto the silence. I was in a state of profound denial, a protective fog that my brain had created to keep me from shattering. I told myself that maybe I was indeed getting older. Maybe the shadows I saw in Clara's eyes were just reflections of my own fears. I tried to convince my heart that her control was just a misguided form of love, a sacrifice she was making to keep our family legacy from crumbling in a changing world. I wanted so badly to believe in the girl who had brought me Lilith every Tuesday. I started making small sacrifices, thinking I could buy back her affection and my own place in the family. I stopped asking for the car keys. I stopped questioning the missing silverware. I even started thanking her for the bland, mushy food she served me, pretending I didn't miss the spice and texture of my own cooking. I was sacrificing my dignity on the altar of peace. I thought if I became small enough, if I became invisible and compliant, she would stop seeing me as an obstacle. I began to treat her with an exaggerated, almost desperate kindness. I would leave little notes for her, praising her for how she handled the business. I was a prisoner trying to charm her jailer, hoping that a smile could soften a heart made of cold, hard ambition. But faith is a double-edged sword when you're dealing with a predator. I found a small prayer book that had belonged to my mother, and inside, I started writing down the things I was seeing not as a diary of evidence, but as a way to prove to God and to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Tuesday, Clara moved the portraits of the grandparents to the basement. She said they were haunting the hallway. Thursday, Arthur's dosage was increased again. He didn't recognize my voice today. I hid the book under a loose floorboard in the chapel. It was my only act of rebellion, my only tie to the truth. I prayed for a miracle, for Leo to wake up, for Arthur to recover, for the scales to fall from everyone's eyes. I believed that if I were just good enough, if my faith were strong enough, the universe would correct this injustice. The denial was a heavy shroud. I watched Leo pull further and further away, his shoulders slouching, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. I saw him looking at me with a mixture of guilt and annoyance, a look that said he wished I would just disappear so he wouldn't have to feel the sting of his own betrayal. Instead of being angry, I felt a devastating pity for him. I told myself he was a victim too, that Clara had him under some kind of psychological lock and key. I started to think that maybe my role now was to suffer in silence, to protect him from the fallout of her inevitable triumph. It was a martyr complex born of absolute powerlessness. I was willing to let her take the house, the money, the land if only she would let me keep the memory of the son I loved. There was one afternoon when Clara followed me to the chapel. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette blocking the light, looking like a dark angel. She didn't come inside. She stayed on the threshold, as if the sacred ground might burn her. You spend a lot of time here, Elena, she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Are you praying for a way out? Or are you just waiting for the end? I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the crucifix, my fingers white from gripping the wooden pew. I'm praying for your soul, Clara, I replied, the words coming from a place of unexpected strength. She laughed a short, dry sound that had no joy in it. My soul is fine. It's your legacy that's burning. You should worry less about heaven and more about where you're going to sleep next year. That was the moment the denial started to crack. The sheer cruelty of her words was like a hammer blow to the glass house I had built around myself. I realized that my sacrifices meant nothing to her. My silence wasn't a peace offering. It was a surrender she was eager to accept. My faith wasn't a shield. It was just a way to keep my eyes closed while she stripped the skin from my bones. I stayed in that chapel long after she left, the cold of the stone seeping into my joints. I realized that God wasn't going to send a lightning bolt to strike her down. If I wanted to save Arthur, if I wanted to save whatever was left of Leo, I had to stop being a martyr. I had to stop being the kind mother and start being the woman who had built this life in the first place. But the fear was still there, a cold, oily slick in my stomach, whispering that it was already too late. The shock didn't come from a hidden letter or a scandalous discovery. It came in a thin, blue folder resting on the mahogany dining table, the table where I had served thousands of family meals, now repurposed as an altar for my execution. I had walked into the room, looking for a glass of water when I saw it. Clara was there, sipping her tea, looking as calm as a frozen lake. "Sit down, Elena," she said, without looking up. "It's time we discuss the transition." Her voice was devoid of the manufactured sweetness of the past months. It was the voice of a liquidator. I opened the folder, and my vision blurred as I saw the words, "Deed of transfer, irrevocable power of attorney, and voluntary commitment for assisted living." She had done it. While I was praying in the chapel and sacrificing my dignity for peace, she had been moving the pieces of the board. Every document I had signed, thinking I was simplifying our assets or protecting Leo's inheritance, had been a nail in the coffin of my autonomy. She had transferred the ownership of the estate to a shell company in her name. But the true betrayal, the one that made the air vanish from my lungs, was Leo's signature. Right there, next to hers, his handwriting, usually so bold and confident, looked shaky, as if he had hesitated before handing over his mother's life. "He knows it's for the best," Clara said, finally meeting my gaze with a terrifying emptiness. "You're a liability now. Arthur is. Well, Arthur won't be with us much longer, and you're just a reminder of a past that doesn't fit the future I'm building." I felt a coldness spread from my chest to my fingertips. "Leo would never do this," I whispered, though the ink on the page screamed otherwise. "He loves this house. He loves me." Clara let out a soft, pitying chuckle. "Leo loves comfort, Elena. And he loves the fact that I handle the debts, he's accumulated debts you didn't even know about because you were too busy smelling your roses." I bought his loyalty with the very money I took from you. It's quite poetic, don't you think? The realization hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't just stolen the money, she had corrupted the only thing I had left. She had used my own resources to turn my son into an accomplice. I wasn't just losing my home. I was realizing that the son I thought I was protecting had already been sold to the highest bidder. Then came the final blow, the one that broke the last of my denial. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, amber-colored vial. "The doctors say Arthur's heart is failing," she whispered, leaning in closer until I could smell the expensive mint on her breath. But it's amazing how a slight adjustment in dosage can accelerate what nature has already started. He's peaceful, Elena. He's drifting away. And once he's gone, there will be no one left to question the validity of these signatures. You'll be in the Sunshine Manor by the weekend. It's a lovely place. High fences. Very quiet. She was confessing to a slow, methodical murder right to my face, knowing I had no phone, no car, no friends left to call. She felt so invincible that she didn't even feel the need to hide her crimes anymore. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a daughter-in-law or even a human being. I saw a void. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had held her when she cried, the hands that had cooked for her, the hands that had signed away my life. They were shaking, but not with fear. For the first time in years, a spark of white-hot rage flickered in the darkness of my soul. I realized that the perfect life I had been trying to save was already dead. There was no family left to protect, only a monster to defeat. But as I looked at the locked doors and the silent house, the weight of the shock settled in. I was an old woman in a gilded cage, and the woman who held the key had just told me she was waiting for my husband to die. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a life shattering. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked toward the window. Outside, my garden was a scarred wasteland of dirt and construction equipment. I realized then that Clara hadn't just wanted the money. She wanted to erase me. She wanted to prove that she could take everything I was and turn it into nothing. The betrayal was absolute. It was a total eclipse of the heart. And as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the room, I knew that the woman who walked into this room was gone. Someone else was taking her place, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. I stared at the signature on the last page until the letters began to dance like spiders in my vision. Leo's L had a specific curl at the end, a flourish I had taught him when he was 7 years old, sitting at this very table. Seeing it there, under a document that essentially stripped me of my humanity, felt like watching him plunge a knife into my chest and twist it with a smile. The air in the room became thick, cloying, as if the oxygen itself had been replaced by the scent of Clara's expensive perfume and the cold musk of old paper. I looked at the voluntary commitment form. Voluntary. The word was a mockery. There is nothing voluntary about being discarded like a piece of broken machinery. Clara leaned back, her chair creaking slightly, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She began to stir her tea, the spoon clinking against the porcelain with a rhythmic, hypnotic precision. "Don't look so surprised, Elena," she said, her voice dropping to a conversational, almost bored tone. "You knew the world was changing. You just thought you were the one holding the leash. But the truth is, you've been obsolete for years. You were just too arrogant to notice that I was the one keeping the lights on." She reached out and tapped the amber vial she had placed on the table. This is Mercy. Arthur is tired. He's been tired of your expectations, your traditions, and your endless need for control. I'm giving him the exit he deserves. A quiet drift into nothingness. The horror of her words began to settle in my bones, a coldness more profound than any winter I had ever known. She wasn't just talking about money or property. She was talking about the systematic erasure of a human soul. "How long?" I managed to choke out, my throat feeling as though it were filled with glass. "How long have you been planning this?" Clara tilted her head, appearing to give the question genuine thought. "Since the second Tuesday I brought you flowers," she replied with a chilling smile. "I realized then that you were hungry for a daughter. And hungry people are so very easy to poison. You gave me your trust on a silver platter, Elena. All I had to do was sharpen my knife. I thought of Leo, my boy, my heart. I thought of the way he had been acting, the way he had avoided my gaze. The betrayal by Clara was expected in hindsight, but the betrayal by my own flesh and blood was a wound that would never close. She saw the pain in my eyes and fed on it like a parasite. "Oh, don't blame Leo too much," she whispered, leaning closer. "He didn't want to sign at first. He cried, actually. It was quite pathetic. But then I showed him the balance sheets. I showed him how much he owed to people who don't take no for an answer. I offered him a clean slate and a life of luxury, between a mother who is already fading and a future that is bright and gold. Well, he made the only logical choice. The room began to spin. I looked at the walls, at the portraits of my ancestors, and felt a sudden, violent urge to scream until my lungs burst. But I stayed silent. I realized that any emotion I showed was just another victory for her. She wanted me to break. She wanted me to beg. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing the grand matriarch reduced to a whimpering child. Instead, I felt something else as strange, crystalline clarity. The shock had burned away the last of my softness. If my son was gone, and my husband was being murdered, then the woman who stood before me wasn't family. She was an enemy combatant in a war I didn't know I was fighting. "You think you've won," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though it sounded like it was coming from someone else. Clara laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "Think, Elena, I have won. Look around you. You have no phone, no car, no money. Your husband is dying, and your son is my employee. By Monday, this house will be legally mine, and you will be a memory in a locked room at Sunshine Manor. There is no one to call, no one to help. You are already a ghost. I'm just waiting for the paperwork to catch up with the reality." She stood up, smoothing her skirt with a chilling finality. "Sleep well, Mother, it's a long drive to the facility tomorrow. The night was a heavy, suffocating blanket, but I had never felt more awake. I didn't go to my bedroom to pack a suitcase for the asylum as Clara had ordered. Instead, I waited until the house settled into that eerie, hollow silence that comes before the dawn. I walked toward the master bedroom where Arthur lay, but I stopped at the doorway when I saw Clara. She was sitting in a chair by his bed, bathed in the pale blue light of her tablet, scrolling through property listings, as if my husband were already a piece of discarded luggage. She didn't hear me enter. I stood there, watching the woman I had called daughter, and for the first time, I didn't feel pain. I felt the cold, hard resolve of a woman who has seen the bottom of the abyss and realized she could still climb. The dosage was always a bit high, wasn't it, Clara? I said, my voice cutting through the stillness like a shard of ice. She jumped, the tablet slipping from her fingers onto the plush carpet. She recovered quickly, her face twisting into that mask of condescending pity. Eleanor, go back to bed. You're having another episode. This is exactly why the doctors at the facility are waiting for you. She stood up, trying to tower over me, but I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I walked past her to Arthur's bedside and took the amber vial from the nightstand, the one she had so arrogantly showed me earlier. I'm not the one having an episode, Clara. I'm the one who finally opened her eyes. She tried to grab the vial from my hand, her fingernails scratching my skin, but I pulled back. The mask of the perfect daughter-in-law finally shattered. Her eyes turned predatory, and the refined woman I thought I knew disappeared, replaced by a street fighter with expensive jewelry. Give me that, you senile old bitch, she hissed, her voice a low, jagged growl. You have nothing. You are nothing. That house you're so proud of? It's a shell company's asset, your son. He's in the guest house right now, drunk and signed away. You think you're making a stand? You're just making it harder for yourself. I could make your time at the manor very, very unpleasant. I looked at Arthur, his chest barely moving, and then back at her. You underestimate a mother's rage, Clara. You thought you bought Leo, but you only bought his fear. And fear is a temporary currency. I stepped closer to her, so close I could see the tiny, frantic pulse in her neck. She was scared. For all her planning and all her legal maneuvers, she hadn't accounted for one thing, a victim who stopped being afraid of the end. I may not have a phone or a car, Clara, but I have the truth. And unlike your papers, the truth doesn't need a signature to be valid. You told me earlier there was no one left to help. You forgot that I've lived in this town for 60 years. I know the secrets of the people you're trying to impress. I know who you've been paying off. She lunged at me then, her hands reaching for my throat, but I shoved her back with a strength I didn't know I still possessed. It was the strength of 30 years of building this home, of every meal cooked and every sacrifice made. She fell against the armchair, her hair disheveled, looking for the first time, like the common thief she was. You're going to jail, Clara, I whispered. She laughed, though it sounded shrill and desperate. With what proof? The police will see a confused old woman and a grieving daughter-in-law. Leo will back me up. He has too. He's an accomplice now. I smiled then, a small, sad smile that made her stop laughing. Leo is many things, Clara. He is weak, he is broken, and he is a coward. But he is still my son. And I know exactly what it takes to make him speak the truth. I walked toward the door, holding the vial like a holy relic. I knew the battle wasn't won. I knew she had the lawyers and the deeds. But as I looked back at her, cowering in the shadows of the room she thought she had stolen, I realized the power dynamic had shifted. She was the one trapped and outrapped by her own greed and the assumption that age equals weakness. The sun is coming up, Clara, I said, my hand on the doorknob. And for the first time in a long time, it's not going to shine on your lies. You should start running, because by the time the lawyers wake up, I won't be the fragile mother anymore. I'll be the woman who destroys everything you've tried to build. The morning light was gray and unforgiving as I walked out of that room, leaving Clara trembling in the shadows. My legs felt like they were made of glass, ready to shatter with every step, but I didn't stop. I went straight to the guest house. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open to find my son, Leo, slumped over the kitchen table, surrounded by empty bottles and the heavy, sour smell of regret. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow, and for a second, he looked like the 5-year-old boy who used to run to me when he had a nightmare. But there was no comfort for him today. I didn't offer a hug, I offered him a choice. I placed the amber vial on the table next to his glass. She's killing your father, Leo, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the room like thunder. And she used your hand to sign my death warrant. Is this the man you wanted to be? He started to sob a ragged, ugly sound that tore at what was left of my heart. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't touch him yet. Every time I looked at him, I saw that signature on the blue folder. He confessed everything then, the words spilling out of him in a desperate, incoherent rush. The gambling debts, the bad investments, the way Clara had methodically dismantled his confidence until he felt he had no choice but to follow her into the dark. He was an accomplice, yes, but he was also a victim of his own weakness. I'll go to the police, he choked out, wiping his face with the back of his hand. I'll tell them everything. I'll go to jail if I have to, Mom, just. Please don't look at me like that. I didn't tell him I forgave him. I couldn't. Not when Arthur was still gasping for air in the other building. The next few hours were a blurred montage of sirens and cold, clinical questions. I had managed to call a former business associate of Arthur's from the guest house landline, a man Clara hadn't managed to alienate yet. He came with his own security and a lawyer who actually remembered what loyalty meant. When the police arrived, Clara tried one last time to play the role of the devoted, worried daughter-in-law. She stood on the porch, her hair perfectly back in place, her voice trembling with artificial concern as she told the officers that I was dangerously confused. But then Leo stepped forward. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor as he handed the officer the blue folder and the vial I had retrieved. The silence that fell over the porch when the lead officer read those documents was the coldest thing I've ever felt. As they led Clara away in handcuffs, she didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just turned her head and looked at me one last time. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a sharp, glittering hatred that promised she would never truly be gone from my nightmares. I watched the police car disappear down the long, winding driveway we had built together, and I felt nothing but no triumph, no joy, just a vast, echoing emptiness. The house stood behind me, a massive monument to a life that had been systematically stripped of its meaning. The brand was gone. The modern aesthetic was just a collection of cold furniture. I was left with a husband who might never wake up and a son I could no longer trust. The legal battle that followed was a slow, agonizing process of untangling the web of shell companies and forged signatures. It turns out, Clara had been more thorough than I imagined. She had moved nearly 60% of our liquid assets offshore. We were rich on paper, but the reality was that we were living in a beautiful shell. I spent my days in hospital waiting rooms and my nights in a house that felt haunted by the ghost of the woman I thought I had gained. The staff Clara hired fled the moment the checks stopped clearing, leaving me alone to scrub the floors and cook the meals, just like I did when Arthur and I first started out. It was a strange kind of penance. Every dish I washed felt like I was scrubbing away a layer of the lies she had built. Leo moved into a small apartment in town, working a job that paid a fraction of what he was used to. We speak, but the conversations are brittle, like dry parchment that might crumble if we press too hard. He asks about his father, and I give him the medical updates, but we don't talk about the blue folder. We don't talk about the day he sold me. Some wounds don't heal, they just become part of the landscape. I look at the garden every day, the dirt, where my roses used to be, and I realize that karma isn't a sudden lightning bolt. It's the slow, quiet realization that you are left with exactly what you deserve. Clara is in a cell, Leo is in his guilt, and I am in the truth. And the truth is the loneliest place I have ever been. Arthur passed away on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 6 months after the sirens had faded from our driveway. He never regained full consciousness, but in those final moments, his hand tightened around mine with a strength that felt like an apology. I like to believe he knew I was there, that he knew I had stayed to guard his transition, just as I had guarded our life for 40 years. When the monitor went flat, I didn't scream. I simply leaned down and whispered into his ear, "It's okay, Arthur. The house is quiet now." I walked out of the hospital alone, feeling the weight of the gold locket against my chest, the one Clara gave me. I hadn't taken it off, not out of love, but as a reminder that the most beautiful things can be the most hollow. The house is too large for one person. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think I hear the click of Clara's heels on the hardwood floors, or the soft, melodic hum she used to have before the mask fell. But when I turn on the light, there is only the dust motes dancing in the air. I've started replanting the garden. It's not the grand, ornamental display it once was. I don't have the energy for that anymore. Instead, I plant simple things, herbs, wildflowers, things that grow without needing to be commanded. My hands are constantly stained with soil, and the skin is rough, but it feels honest. There is no deception in the earth. It gives back exactly what you put into it. No more and no less. Leo comes over on Sundays. He doesn't stay for long. He sits at the kitchen table, the same table where the blue folder once sat, and he drinks his coffee in silence. We don't talk about the trial, or the way Clara looked in her orange jumpsuit, or the fact that he is still paying off the debts that nearly drowned us all. We talk about the weather, or the way the roof needs shingling. One Sunday, he looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken plea for a forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, the words finally breaking through the wall of our polite small talk. I looked at him, my only child, and I realized that, while I loved him, I would never fully trust him again. "I know, Leo," I replied. But sorry doesn't replant the roses. I visited Clara once. I didn't want to, but a part of me needed to see if there was any humanity left in the wreckage. She looked smaller behind the glass, the designer clothes replaced by a drab uniform, but her eyes were still the same bright, cold, and hungry. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for mercy. She spent 20 minutes telling me how she would have succeeded if I hadn't been so unpredictable. She saw her failure not as a moral collapse, but as a tactical error. As I walked away from the visitor's booth, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I realized that she had never truly owned me. She had owned my house, my money, and my son's loyalty, but she never touched the core of who I was. Her karma wasn't just the prison cell. It was the fact that she was incapable of feeling the very love she had tried so hard to simulate. People in town look at me with a mixture of pity and awe. They call me strong, but they don't understand that strength is often just the absence of other options. I am a survivor of a war that took place in my own living room. I have learned that family isn't a bloodline or a legal document. It's a series of choices we make every single day. Clara chose greed. Leo chose fear. And I chose to survive. I spend my evenings on the porch now, watching the sunset over the hills. The golden light doesn't look like a painting anymore. It just looks like the end of another day. I am Elena, and I am alone, but I am no longer a ghost in my own home. The perfect beginning was a lie, the shock was a rebirth, and the aftermath is simply my life. I have learned to live with the silence. It's not a hollow silence anymore. It's a peaceful one. As I touch the scars on my hands from that night in the bedroom, I realize that karma didn't just come for Clara. It came for me too, stripping away my arrogance and my blindness, leaving me with nothing but the truth. And in the twilight of my years, I finally understand that the truth is the only thing worth owning. The roses will grow again next spring. They won't be the same ones, but they will be mine, and that is enough.